The blood was the first thing Clara noticed. Not the figure standing in the doorway of the healer's cottage. Not the sheer width of his shoulders, or the black fur mantle draped across them like the pelt of something ancient and wild. Not the leather straps crossing his chest, worn and cracked from years of use, or the iron buckles still damp with rain. She noticed none of that first. She noticed the blood. It ran in a dark, steady line from somewhere beneath his left arm, tracing the ridge of his forearm before dripping from his fingers onto the stone floor of her cottage. Each drop landed with a quiet, deliberate sound, like a clock marking time, and Clara stood frozen at her work table with a half-crushed bundle of yarrow still in her fist. The man did not speak. He simply stood there, filling the doorframe so completely that the gray afternoon light behind him seemed to bend around his body. His dark braids were soaked through, pressed flat against his neck by the rain that still fell in cold sheets outside. His eyes, pale and sharp as winter ice, moved slowly around the small room, across the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, across the rows of clay jars and wooden vials, across the low fire burning in the hearth, and finally, across her. Clara set the yarrow down. "Sit," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man said nothing. He remained in the doorway for a moment longer, long enough that Clara wondered if he was deciding whether the word sit was something a man like him obeyed. Then, with the careful, controlled movement of someone who refused to show how much pain they were carrying, he stepped inside and lowered himself onto the stool beside her work table. The cottage felt smaller immediately. Clara moved without rushing. She crossed to the basin near the fire and poured water from the iron pot that had been warming since morning. She gathered linen strips from the shelf above the window, a small clay jar of pine resin salve, and the needle and thread she kept wrapped in oiled cloth on the highest shelf. Her hands worked from memory. They always did. "You need to remove the outer layer," she said, nodding toward his arm. He unclasped the leather chest harness with practiced efficiency and set it aside on the table with a sound that rattled her clay jars. Beneath it, his dark tunic was torn and soaked through on the left side. Clara brought the oil lamp closer and bent to look. The wound was deep. A long cut, not from a blade, she thought. The edges were ragged in a way that no sword or knife produced. Something with claws had opened him from his lower ribs nearly to the back of his shoulder. It had stopped bleeding only because the cold rain had helped close the surface, but the deeper tissue was still weeping steadily. Clara worked in silence. She cleaned the wound carefully with the warm water, removing grit and dried blood with a linen cloth. The man made no sound. Not when the cloth moved over the deepest part of the cut, not when she pressed the edges together to examine how far the damage went. His jaw was set. His pale eyes were fixed on the far wall. "This will need stitching," Clara said. "Then stitch it." His voice was low and rough, like gravel settling after a landslide. Clara threaded the needle without answering and began. She had stitched wounds before. Hunters from the village. Farmers who had met with misfortune from plows or axes or the hind legs of frightened horses. She had stitched her own palm once, 3 winters past, when a jar had shattered and sliced deep across her hand. She knew the work. She did not enjoy it, but she knew it. This was different. Not because the wound was particularly complex, though it was, but because with every careful pass of the needle, she was increasingly aware that the man beneath her hands was not simply a traveler who had stumbled off the forest road. There was something in the way he sat, the deliberate stillness, the absolute refusal to flinch. There were old scars beneath the new wound, pale, silvered lines crossing his ribs and shoulder, too many and too varied to belong to any ordinary life. She tied the last knot and cut the thread. "The pine resin will draw out any rot," she said, reaching for the clay jar. "Leave the linen on for 2 days. Don't get it wet again." She began pressing the salve gently along the line of stitches. The fire crackled, Rain struck the shuttered window in irregular bursts. The man's breathing was slow and even, though she suspected it took effort to keep it that way. "Where did you come from?" she asked. It was not entirely curiosity. It was also practical. If he had traveled far in this weather, infection would come faster. He didn't answer immediately. Then, the northern ridge. Clara paused for just a moment. The northern ridge was 3 hours on horseback in good weather. In this rain, on a horse, bleeding. She pressed that thought aside and kept her hands moving. "You should rest before you ride again," she said. "I won't be resting here." "I'm not offering you a bed," she replied evenly. "I'm telling you that if you ride out in the next hour, my stitches won't hold. You'll be back on this floor before nightfall, and there won't be anything left to stitch." A long silence stretched between them. "You speak plainly," he said. "Sick people don't benefit from pretty words." Something shifted in his expression, barely a movement, a slight easing around the eyes. And then it was gone. He looked back at the far wall. Clara wrapped the wound in clean linen, crossing the strips beneath his arm and tying them with firm, careful knots. She was close enough to smell the rain still caught in his hair, the cold pine of the forest on his skin, the iron scent of old blood. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her then, directly, and there was something in that pale gaze, not cruelty, not arrogance, but something older and heavier than either, that made the question feel suddenly very small. "Does it matter?" he asked. Clara tied the last knot and stepped back. "Not to me," she said. "But the next healer you visit might want to know whose wounds she's closing." She turned back to her work table and began cleaning the needle. Behind her, she heard the slow sound of the leather harness being refastened, the low creak of the stool, the deliberate footsteps across the stone floor. She heard the door open, letting in a gust of cold, wet air that made the fire lean sideways. She did not turn around. The door closed. Clara stood alone in her cottage, the needle in her hand, the fire settling back into its rhythm. She looked down at the linen cloth she'd used, dark with blood, and then at the stone floor where those first drops had fallen. She didn't know who he was. She told herself it didn't matter. But when she pressed her fingers to the work table to steady herself, she realized her hands were trembling, and they hadn't trembled once while she worked. Outside, 2 riders waited in the tree line at the edge of the road. They straightened when the tall figure emerged from the cottage doorway and walked toward them through the rain without hurrying. One of them, a broad man with a scar running from his chin to his left ear, leaned forward in his saddle. "My lord," he said quietly, "you were gone a long time." "Ride," said the man with the braids. They rode, and 3 hours later, behind the stone walls of a fortress that sat on the northern ridge like a crown of dark iron, a messenger was sent back down the mountain road with a single instruction, delivered in a voice that expected no argument. "Find out who she is." Clara learned his name, the way most people in the valley learned things that were meant to be kept from them, through whispers that traveled faster than any rider on the road. It started the following morning. She had risen before dawn, as she always did, to check on the poultice she had left steeping overnight in a covered pot near the hearth. The fire had burned low, and the cottage held the particular chill of early autumn, the kind that settled into stone floors and refused to leave until midday. She wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and moved through her small space in the gray half-light, feeding the fire, measuring dried herbs into a mortar, grinding them into powder with the same methodical patience that had shaped every morning of her adult life. She was 24 years old. She had lived alone in this cottage at the edge of Ashvale village for 3 years, since her mentor, the old healer Edna, had died quietly in the bed that now served as Clara's own. Edna had taught her everything: which roots drew out fever, which leaves sealed infected skin, how to tell from a wound's color whether rot had already set in, and how to sit beside someone in pain without filling the silence with words they didn't need. Clara had been a good student. She had also been a practical one. She did not spend much time wondering about things she could not change, which was why she had almost successfully stopped thinking about the man with the pale eyes and the deep wound when Marin arrived. Marin was the baker's wife, a round, energetic woman of 50 who treated information the way some people treated bread dough. She worked it constantly, turned it over, and eventually delivered it to everyone in the village, whether they wanted it or not. She arrived at Clara's door just after sunrise, with a cloth-wrapped bundle of oat rolls, still warm from the oven, and an expression that meant she had something to say, and was barely containing it. "You had a visitor yesterday," Marin said, before she was fully through the door. "I have visitors most days," Clara replied, without looking up from the mortar. "I'm a healer. Not like this one." Marin set the rolls on the table and pulled her shawl tighter. Aldrich the woodsman was coming down the ridge road yesterday evening, and he saw them. 3 riders. The one in the middle, big man, dark braids. She lowered her voice, as if the walls might carry the words somewhere dangerous. "Clara, that was Lucian Voss." Clara's hand stilled on the pestle. "The Alpha King," Marin continued, watching her face carefully. "Lord of the Northern Packs. The man who ended the Greywood War in a single season. The man who—" "I know who Lucian Voss is," Clara said quietly. "Everyone in the valley knew. You did not live within 3 days' ride of the Northern Ridge without knowing the name, Lucian Voss. He had taken control of the unified wolf pack 7 years ago after the death of his father, and he had spent those 7 years doing what every lord before him had tried and failed to do. Holding a fractured, violent coalition of wolf bloodlines together through a combination of iron discipline and, according to rumor, sheer force of will. The villages along the northern corridor paid their seasonal tribute without complaint. Not out of affection, out of the particular kind of respect that comes from knowing that the alternative is considerably worse. He was not, by any account she had ever heard, the sort of man who visited village healers. "He was wounded," Clara said, keeping her voice neutral. Marin's eyes widened. "How badly?" "Badly enough to need stitching, not badly enough to kill him." She resumed grinding. "He's gone now. That's the end of it." But Marin was already rearranging her expression into something that Clara recognized as the precursor to further complication. Aldrich also said, and mind you, this is only what Aldrich said, so take it as you will, that there was a rider who came back down the mountain road late last night, asking questions in the village, about the healer at the edge of the road. Clara set the pestle down very slowly. "What kind of questions?" "Your name. How long you'd been here. Whether you'd trained under anyone. Whether you had family." Marin folded her hands together on the table. "Clara, why would the Alpha King send someone to ask questions about you?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She crossed to the window and looked out at the narrow strip of road visible between the tree line. It was empty in the early morning light. Fallen leaves, dark with moisture, lay plastered to the muddy ground. The sky was the color of pewter. "I don't know," she said. It was almost true. The answer came that same afternoon, in the form of 2 men on horseback, who stopped in front of her cottage with the deliberate, unhurried posture of people who had never in their lives needed to hurry because they needed anything. Clara was in the small garden behind the cottage, cutting back the last of the autumn sage before the frost took it, when she heard the horses on the road. She straightened and walked around to the front without rushing. The 2 men were dismounting. Both wore the dark leather and iron bucklework she recognized from the previous day. Pack soldiers, clearly. One of them, the broad man with the scar along his jaw, she recognized as having waited in the tree line while she worked. He held out a folded piece of dark parchment, sealed with black wax. "For the healer," he said. Clara wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt and took it. She broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting inside was angular and precise. Each letter pressed firmly into the page as though uncertain things had no place in its world. Your services are required at the Northern Fortress. You will be escorted tomorrow at first light. Bring what you need for a stay of unspecified duration. This is not a request. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and looked up at the man with the scar. Unspecified duration, she said. Yes. I have patients in this village who depend on regular care. An elderly man with a chest illness. 2 children recovering from river fever. She kept her voice even. I'll need someone to send word to the midwife in Crest Hollow to cover for me while I'm gone. The scarred man blinked. This was apparently not the response he had been prepared for. We can arrange that. Good. She refolded the letter and pressed it into her apron pocket. I'll be ready at first light. She went back inside and closed the door behind her. For a long moment she stood in the center of her cottage. The familiar smell of dried herbs and wood smoke, the low crackling of the fire, the rows of jars and the worn surface of her work table. And she breathed. This is not a request. She knew what that meant. She was not naive about the world or about the kind of power that sent riders to small villages with sealed letters. She had no illusions that refusing was truly an option, and yet something else moved beneath the fear. Something she was reluctant to name. A needle-sharp thread of curiosity she couldn't quite cut. He had left without giving his name. He had sent someone to ask questions about her. And now, less than a day after she had closed his wound with linen thread in her small stone cottage, the most feared man on the northern ridge had ordered her brought to his fortress. Why? She began pulling jars from her shelves, selecting what she would need. Her hands were steady. She had learned, from Edna, from years of sitting beside people in pain, that fear was not the enemy. Fear was simply information. What mattered was what you did while you felt it. She wrapped her instruments in oiled cloth. She packed the pine resin salve and a full supply of clean linen. She added her most important jars, the ones that held the medicines she could not easily replace, and wrapped each one individually in scraps of wool to protect them from the journey. Then she sat down beside the fire to wait for morning. Outside, the 2 riders remained at the edge of the road in the gathering dark, patient as stones. And high above, on the northern ridge, behind walls of dark stone, a man sat in a chair with his left side wrapped in linen, staring at a map he was not reading, thinking about a woman who had told him to sit and meant it. The northern fortress had no name that anyone used warmly. Those who lived beneath its shadow called it the Ridge Hold, spoken in the same flat tone people used for words like winter and debt. Things that simply existed, immovable and indifferent to your feelings about them. It sat at the crest of the mountain road, like something the rock itself had decided to become. Dark stone walls rising 30 feet from the cliff top, iron-braced gates wide enough for 4 horses abreast, watchtowers at every corner with fires burning even in daylight. The surrounding pines were old and enormous, and they leaned slightly away from the fortress walls as though they had learned, over centuries, to give it space. Clara saw it first through the gray morning mist as the horses crested the final ridge, and she understood immediately why people did not speak of it warmly. It was not built to be loved. It was built to last. She rode between the 2 escorts on a brown mare they had provided, a calm, steady animal that picked its way up the mountain road without complaint, which Clara appreciated. She had spent the journey in silence, watching the forest change around them as they climbed. The oak and ash of the valley giving way to pine and fir, the undergrowth thinning, the air growing sharper and colder until each breath carried the clean bite of altitude. By the time the gates appeared through the mist, her gray wool cloak was heavy with moisture, and her fingers, wrapped around the reins, had gone stiff with cold. The gates opened before they arrived. Someone had been watching. Inside the walls, the fortress was more alive than its exterior suggested. The main courtyard was wide and flagged with uneven stone, busy with the particular purposeful movement of a military household. Stable hands leading horses, soldiers crossing between buildings in pairs, servants moving with the quick head-down efficiency of people who had learned that being noticed was not always advantageous. The smell of the place was wood smoke and horse and leather, and beneath it all, the cold mineral scent of the mountain itself seeping up through the stone. Clara dismounted and handed the reins to a stable boy who appeared at her elbow without being summoned. She pulled her satchel from the saddlebag and settled it over her shoulder. The scarred soldier, she had learned during the ride that his name was Brennan, gestured toward the main building. This way. She followed him through a heavy oak door, into a corridor lit by iron sconces set into the stone walls at intervals. The corridor was long and cold, the floor worn smooth by years of boots. Shields and weapons hung on the walls. Not decoratively, she thought, but practically, the way a working man hangs his tools where he can reach them. Everything in this place seemed to exist for a reason. Nothing was ornamental. Brennan led her up a staircase and along a second corridor, before stopping at a door near the far end. He knocked once, not the tentative knock of someone seeking permission, but the firm knock of someone announcing an arrival. "The healer," he said through the door. A pause. Then, "Send her in." Brennan pushed the door open and stepped aside. Clara walked in. The room was large by the standards of the fortress, a working space more than a receiving room. A long oak table dominated the center, its surface buried under maps, sealed letters, and what appeared to be territorial records written in several different hands. Bookshelves lined one wall, their contents a mix of bound volumes and rolled parchment. A fire burned in a wide stone hearth. 2 candles on the table added their light to the gray daylight coming through the narrow windows, which looked out over the cliff top and, beyond it, nothing but sky and the distant suggestion of further mountains. Lucien Voss stood beside the window with his back to her, looking out. He was dressed differently than he had been in her cottage. A dark tunic with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, leather trousers, boots that reached his knees. No fur mantle, no harness. Without the armor of his traveling clothes, he looked, paradoxically, more dangerous, the way a blade looks more itself when stripped of its scabbard. His dark braids were dry now, pulled back from his face. The scar at his jaw, old, she thought, years old, caught the firelight. He turned when she entered. His pale eyes moved to her satchel first, then to her face, with the efficient assessment of someone who had spent years reading rooms and people quickly. "You came," he said. "Your letter made the alternative seem inadvisable," Clara replied. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. He crossed to the table and pulled a chair away from it, setting it to one side. Not an invitation for her to sit. He was clearing space. "The wound," he said, by way of explanation. "Show me what's happening." Clara set her satchel on the table and opened it. "Sit down and I'll look at it." He sat. She noted that this time he did it without the long pause. She unwrapped the linen carefully. The stitching had held. She felt a small, quiet satisfaction at that. And the skin around the wound was only mildly inflamed, which was better than she had feared given that he had apparently ridden 3 hours on horseback the day of the injury. "You rode yesterday," she said. It wasn't a question. "I had to." The stitches held, but only just. She pressed gently along the edge of the wound, checking for the heat and swelling that preceded rot. "You're fortunate. Another hour in the rain before reaching shelter and we would be having a different conversation. What conversation would that be? The one where I explain to your soldiers that I can't stop infection that's already in the bone." She kept her voice matter of fact. "Hold still." He held still. She cleaned the wound again, applied a fresh layer of pine resin salve, slightly warmer than the first application, drawing more efficiently now that the surface had begun to close, and began rewrapping it with clean linen. She worked methodically, aware of his eyes on the side of her face throughout. "You're not afraid," he said. Clara tied off the linen and smoothed the edge flat before answering. "I'm a healer. Fear makes hands unsteady. I can't afford unsteady hands. Most people who come into this room are afraid. Most people who come into this room are probably here for political reasons," she said. "I'm here for a wound." She stepped back and began repacking her satchel. "The inflammation is manageable. You need to rest the arm. No sword work, no riding for at least 4 more days. The stitches can come out in 10 days if the healing continues at this rate." 4 days, he repeated, as though the concept was faintly absurd. 4 days, she confirmed, without apology. He was quiet for a moment. She fastened the buckle on her satchel and was calculating the logistics of the return journey. Whether the mist had cleared enough for safe travel down the mountain road, whether she could reach Ashvale before dark, when he spoke again. "There's a sickness in the lower quarters of this fortress," he said. "It started 3 days ago. 4 of my soldiers. High fever, pain in the chest, a cough that brings up dark matter." Clara stopped moving. "The pack physician is away," Lucian continued. "He left for the eastern settlements before the sickness began. He won't return for 2 weeks. She turned back to face him. "How close are the sick quarters to the rest of the population in this fortress?" "The same building, different floor. That needs to change immediately." She was already opening her satchel again, pulling out the small journal she used for notes, reaching for the stub of charcoal she kept tucked inside the cover. "How many people total in this fortress?" "Approximately 200. "And the 4 who are sick, are they from the same unit? Do they train together, eat together, share water from the same source?" His pale eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes, the Eastern Patrol Unit. I need to see them." She was already moving toward the door. "And I need the sick quarters separated from the rest of the building tonight, not tomorrow. If this spreads through 200 people in an enclosed fortress in autumn, your physician will come back to a disaster." She had her hand on the door before she registered that she had just given orders in the Alpha King's private study and walked toward his door without being dismissed. She stopped, turned around slowly. Lucian Voss was watching her from his chair with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between surprise and evaluation. The way a man looks at a map that turns out to cover more territory than he expected. "I apologize," Clara said carefully. "I should have—" "Brennan," Lucian said, raising his voice only slightly. The door opened immediately. Brennan appeared in the frame. "Take her to the eastern quarter," Lucian said. "Give her whatever she asks for." Brennan looked at Clara, then back at his lord, and nodded once. "Yes, my lord." Clara followed Brennan into the corridor. The door closed behind her. And in the study, Lucian Voss remained seated beside the fire for a long moment, his eyes on the closed door, his expression still doing that thing it almost never did, thinking about something that had surprised him. The sickness was worse than Clara had hoped, and not quite as bad as she had feared. The 4 soldiers in the eastern quarter were grown men, broad-shouldered and battle-hardened, and yet the illness had reduced them to something smaller. Pale faces sheened with sweat, breathing that came in shallow, effortful pulls, the kind of cough that sounded like it was trying to turn a person inside out. The room smelled of fever and damp straw, and the particular sour heaviness of bodies fighting something they couldn't see. Clara moved between the 4 pallets without hesitation, checking each man in turn. She pressed the back of her hand to foreheads, listened to breathing with her ear close to each chest, examined what the cough had produced on the linen beside each man with the calm, unsentimental attention Edna had drilled into her from the very beginning. "The sickness doesn't care if you're squeamish," the old woman had told her once. "And neither do I." By the time she had examined all 4, she had a clear enough picture. Marsh lung. She had seen it twice before. Once in a family near the river flats south of Asheville. Once in an old shepherd who spent too many wet nights in low-lying pasture. It came from breathing cold, stagnant air over an extended period, combined with wet conditions and exhaustion. It was not a plague, It would not move between people like fire through dry grass. But left untreated in men already worn down by patrol work and poor autumn weather, it could hollow out the lungs over the course of 2 or 3 weeks and become something that couldn't be undone. She straightened and turned to Brennan, who had positioned himself near the door, with the practiced stillness of a man who was pretending the smell in the room wasn't bothering him. "It's marsh lung," she said. "It won't spread to the rest of the fortress. You can ease that concern. But these 4 need immediate and consistent treatment, or 2 of them, at minimum, won't recover fully." She glanced at the pallets. "The 2 on the left are further along. They're my priority." Brennan exhaled slowly. "What do you need?" "Elderflower and thyme, as much as you have in whatever stores this fortress keeps. Pine bark if you have it. A pot for boiling at all times over a low fire in this room. Clean linen, changed twice daily. Broth, real broth, from bones, not water with salt in it. For each of them morning and evening. And the windows in this room need to be opened slightly, even at night. Especially at night. Stagnant air made them sick. Fresh air will help unmake it." Brennan was nodding, keeping pace. "The stores will have most of that. Pine bark I'm not certain of. I have some in my satchel, enough for 3 days. After that we'll need to source more." She was already moving back to the nearest pallet, pushing her sleeves up. "I'll start the first treatment now. Can you have the broth sent within the hour?" "Yes, and someone to help. Not a soldier. Someone who can sit with sick people without needing to do anything heroic. A kitchen worker, a stable hand, someone patient." Brennan almost smiled at that. Almost. "I know someone," he said, and left. Clara spent the next 3 hours in the eastern quarter without stopping. She boiled the first batch of elderflower and thyme in the iron pot that hung over the room's small hearth, adding strips of pine bark from her supply and a measured pinch of dried ginger root that she always carried for fever cases. When the steam rose thick and fragrant, sharp green and medicinal, cutting through the heavy sickroom air, she positioned each man to breathe it in controlled intervals, covering their heads with linen to hold the vapor close. It was slow work, an unglamorous work, requiring patience and repetition, and she did it without complaint. The kitchen worker Brennan sent was a young woman named Dora, perhaps 17, with ink-dark hair and very serious eyes, who turned out to be exactly what Clara had asked for. She was quiet. She followed instructions without embellishment, and she had the useful quality of being able to sit beside a coughing, feverish man for an extended period, without looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. "You've done this before," Clara observed, during a brief pause while the pot refueled. "My mother was sick 2 winters ago," Dora said simply. "I sat with her." "Did she recover?" "Yes." "Good." Clara handed her a fresh linen strip. "Then you know that most of this is just time and attention. The medicines help, but mostly it's time." Dora nodded and went back to her work. It was nearly dark when Clara finally stepped out of the eastern quarter and into the corridor, rolling her sleeves back down and pressing her hands briefly against the cool stone wall. Her back ached from bending. Her eyes felt dry and heavy. She hadn't eaten since the oat rolls Marin had brought before dawn, and the smell of the broth she'd been feeding to the sick soldiers had been quietly tormenting her for the past hour. She was mentally calculating whether she could reasonably ask for food before attempting the return journey down the mountain road, when she became aware of someone standing at the far end of the corridor. Lucian. He was leaning against the wall with his right shoulder, his injured left arm held slightly away from his body in the unconscious way of someone managing pain they have decided not to acknowledge. He was watching her with those pale, still eyes, and he had clearly been there for some time. "The marsh lung," he said, when she reached him. "Will they live?" "All 4 should recover if the treatment continues consistently." She kept her voice professional. "The 2 most affected will need 2 weeks, possibly 3. The other 2 should be functional within 10 days. He absorbed this with a slight nod. "And it won't move through the fortress." "No, It's not that kind of sickness. She paused. You were worried about that. 200 people in stone walls in autumn, he said. Yes. Clara looked at him for a moment. The firelight from the sconce above him caught the angles of his face, the hard line of his jaw, the old scar, the careful blankness that she was beginning to recognize as the expression he wore when he was actually thinking quite a lot. You should eat, he said unexpectedly. She blinked. I was about to ask where I might find food before riding back. Something crossed his face that she still couldn't fully categorize. You're not riding back tonight. The road is dark and wet and steep, he said, and you've been working since before dawn. He pushed off the wall and began walking. A pause, then a glance back at her that was not quite an invitation and not quite a command, but landed somewhere in the narrow space between. Come. Clara hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she followed. He led her not to a formal hall, but to a smaller room off the main corridor. A room that felt like it was used for practical purposes rather than ceremony. A table with 4 chairs, a fire already lit, a tray with bread and cheese and a pot of something that smelled of roasted vegetables and herbs. Simple food, the kind that a working household ate, rather than the kind that a powerful man displayed. Lucian sat. Clara sat across from him. He poured water from a clay pitcher into 2 cups and pushed one toward her without ceremony. She ate. He ate. For a while there was only the fire and the quiet sounds of the fortress settling into night. It was Lucian who broke the silence. How long have you been a healer? Since I was 16, Clara said. I apprenticed under an old woman in Ashvale. She trained me until she died 3 years ago. And before that? She looked up. The question was more specific than it seemed, and something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer to at least part of it. I came to Ashvale from the south, she said carefully. My family's village was... She stopped, chose different words. There was a sickness when I was 15. I was the only one in my family who survived it. Edna found me on the road and brought me to Ashvale. The room was quiet. Lucian was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the hard assessment, not the careful blankness. Something quieter. I'm sorry, he said. And it sounded, with surprising clarity, like he meant it. Clara looked down at her bread. It was a long time ago. Long ago doesn't always mean finished, he said. She looked up at that. He was looking at the fire now, not at her. There was something in his profile, in the set of his jaw, and the particular stillness of someone who has just said something that came from somewhere real, that made her want to ask a question she had no right to ask. She didn't ask it. But she stored it away, carefully, the way she stored ingredients she didn't yet know the use for. They finished eating. Clara was shown to a small room near the east corridor, plain, warm, with a narrow bed and a candle, and a window that looked out over the dark pines. She set her satchel on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. She intended to think clearly about her situation. A woman alone in a mountain fortress at the request of the most powerful man in the Northern Territory, with no clear date for return, surrounded by soldiers she didn't know. Instead, she found herself thinking about what he had said. Long ago doesn't always mean finished. And she thought, he wasn't only talking about me. She blew out the candle. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves. And somewhere below in the fortress, a watch bell rang once, marking the deep of night. Clara lay in the dark and listened. And in his study down the long corridor, a man with pale eyes and an old weight behind them sat alone at his table, with a map he still wasn't reading, thinking about a healer who had walked into his sick room without flinching and looked at his wounded soldiers as though they were simply people who needed help. which was, he was beginning to realize, a rarer thing than it should have been. 3 days passed inside the ridgehold, and Clara learned the shape of the place the way she learned most things. Quietly, through observation, through the details that revealed themselves when no one was performing for an audience. She learned that the fortress woke before dawn without being told to, that the soldiers who trained in the courtyard each morning did so in near silence. The only sounds the rhythmic impact of wooden practice blades and boots on stone. That the kitchen ran with the efficient, no-nonsense energy of people who understood that 200 mouths required serious organization, and that the woman who ran it, a broad, gray-haired figure named Hesta, tolerated no disorder and accepted no excuses, including from people who outranked her. She learned that Brennan, beneath the scarred exterior and the military bearing, had a habit of checking on the sick soldiers 3 times a day, and standing in the doorway longer than was strictly necessary, watching their breathing with an expression he thought no one noticed. She noticed. She learned that the fortress had a library, a real one. 2 floors of the North Tower given over entirely to bound volumes and rolled maps and records going back 4 generations. And that it was warm and quiet, and smelled of old paper and pine resin. And that she was apparently welcome to use it because on the second morning she had found it by accident and settled into a window chair with a volume on northern medicinal plants, and no one had asked her to leave. She learned, gradually and carefully, that Lucien Voss was not what the valley's whispers had made him. This was the most complicated thing she learned, and the one she turned over most often in the quiet of her small room at night. The man the rumors described was iron and distance, a ruler who had ended the Greywood War through methods people referred to obliquely, a figure who commanded absolute obedience and gave nothing personal in return. And there was truth in that portrait. She could see it in the way the soldiers moved around him, in the absolute absence of casual conversation when he entered a room, in the way every door in the fortress seemed to open before he reached it, as if the building itself had learned to anticipate him. But there were other things she saw that didn't fit the portrait. She saw him stop in the corridor outside the eastern quarter on the second morning, when he thought no one was watching, and speak quietly to Dora, not commanding, not dismissing, but asking a specific question about one of the 6 soldiers that could only have come from someone who had checked on them personally the night before. She saw the map room when Brennan showed her through on an errand, and noticed the territorial records on the far table marked in Lucien's own angular hand. Not just boundaries and resources, but detailed notes on water access and crop conditions in the villages under his protection. The notes of someone who was actually paying attention to the people who lived in his territory, not just the land they occupied. She saw him, on the 3rd evening, sitting alone in the library when she came to return her book. He didn't hear her immediately. He was bent over an open volume with a candle pulled close, his injured arm resting on the table. His expression, unguarded in the way faces only are when they believe themselves unobserved, carrying something that looked very much like exhaustion. Not physical, the other kind. She must have made a sound because he looked up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "I came to return this," Clara said, holding up the plant volume. He nodded toward the shelf. She crossed the room, slid the book back into its place, and was almost at the door when he spoke. "The soldiers," he said. "Are they improving?" She turned. The 2 most affected turned a corner this afternoon. The fever broke in both of them within an hour of each other, which is unusual but not unheard of. The other 2 are nearly well. She paused. "Another week and they'll be fit for light duty." He exhaled, a small, controlled sound that nonetheless told her more than he probably intended. "Good." Clara looked at him for a moment. The candle between them made the shadows in the room shift and lean. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines again, a steady, low sound like the mountain breathing. "You were afraid you'd lose them," she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. The kind she made when she was trying to understand something clearly. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. His expression moved through several things she couldn't entirely name, before settling into something quieter than his usual guardedness. "They've been in my Eastern Patrol for 4 years," he said. "They rode through the Greywood campaign. All of them." He looked back at the candle. "Men who survive that together. That's not a unit anymore. That's something else." "Family," Clara said quietly. He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree. The complication arrived on the 4th morning in the form of a rider who came up the mountain road before breakfast, carrying a sealed letter that made Brennan's expression do something tight and controlled when he read it. Clara was in the eastern quarter checking on her patients when Brennan appeared in the doorway. "My lord wants you," he said simply. She found Lucian in the map room, standing at the table with the letter open in his right hand. 2 other soldiers she hadn't seen before stood near the wall. Older men, senior by the look of them, with the specific gravity of people who had been carrying difficult information for several hours. "Close the door," Lucian said when she entered. She closed it. "There's a village," he said without preamble, "called Fenwick, 2 days south of here. It came under my territory's protection 4 years ago after the Greywood settlement." He set the letter down on the table and pressed his fingers flat beside it. 3 days ago, someone poisoned their water source. 14 people sick. 2 dead. The sickness doesn't match anything my men have seen before. Clara felt the information land in her chest with a quiet, heavy impact. "The letter describes the symptoms," he continued. "I need you to read it." She crossed to the table and picked up the letter. She read it twice, slowly, while the room waited. The symptoms were specific. Sudden onset, violent stomach cramping, the particular gray-blue color at the fingertips that she recognized from a single entry in a volume Edna had kept on rare southern poisons. A book Clara had read twice and never expected to need. Her mind moved quickly and coldly through what she knew. "This isn't a natural sickness," she said. "No," Lucian agreed. "The symptoms, the fingertip discoloration particularly, match copper salt poisoning, concentrated. It would need to be introduced deliberately into a water supply." She set the letter down carefully. This was done by someone who knew what they were doing. The room was very quiet. "Who?" she asked, looking up at him. Lucian's jaw was set. "There is a man named Dorian Ashcroft. He held territorial claims in the Fenwick Valley before the Greywood settlement transferred it to my protection. He has been unhappy about that transfer since it occurred." He glanced at the 2 senior soldiers. "We received intelligence 2 weeks ago that he had been purchasing compounds from a southern merchant. We didn't move quickly enough on it. You need to send healers to Fenwick immediately," Clara said. "Copper salt poisoning is treatable if caught early enough. The 2 who died, if they died within the first day, the others may still have time. They need large quantities of clean water, raw egg white if you can get it there, and willow bark for the cramping. The most critical thing is stopping them from drinking any more from the contaminated source and flushing what's already in their bodies." She was already moving back to the door. "Where are you going?" Lucian asked. "To pack what I have." She stopped with her hand on the door. "I'm going to Fenwick." "That wasn't what I—" "2 people are already dead." She turned to face him fully. "And there are 12 more who might follow them if the person who arrives knows what copper salt poisoning looks like in its 3rd day. Do your senior healers know that?" Lucian looked at her. The 2 soldiers near the wall were very carefully not looking at either of them. "No," he said. "Then I'm going to Fenwick." She held his gaze. "Send soldiers if you need to. Send Brennan if it makes you feel better about the road. But I'm going." Another silence, longer this time. "Brennan," Lucian said. Brennan materialized from somewhere. He had a talent for that. "Prepare a full escort. We ride within the hour." Clara caught the word "we" and felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. but she didn't remark on it. She opened the door and went to pack. The ride to Fenwick took most of the day. They arrived as the sun was dropping behind the western hills, and the village was settling into the particular frightened quiet of a place that had lost people and didn't know if it was finished losing them. Clara worked through the night. Lucian did not hover. He did not interfere. He organized the soldiers into a perimeter, arranged for clean water to be brought from an upland spring 3 miles from the village, and handled with calm, absolute authority the logistics of keeping 200 frightened villagers orderly, while a healer moved between the sick with the focused efficiency of someone who had set aside everything except the work. By morning, 4 more of the sick had turned corners. 3 remained critical. By the second morning, all 12 were alive. Clara sat on a low stone wall at the edge of the village as the sun came up, her cloak wrapped around her, her hands folded in her lap. She was deeply tired in the way that follows sustained, concentrated effort. A tiredness that went all the way down to the bone and settled there. Not unpleasantly. She heard footsteps on the stone path and looked up. Lucian sat down on the wall beside her. Not close, but near enough that she was aware of his presence as a solid, quiet thing against the cold morning air. 12, he said. 12, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Dorian Ashcroft has been taken into custody. His compound was found at his estate. A pause. He will answer for the 2 who died. Clara nodded. She looked out at the village, the small stone houses, the smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as morning fires were lit. A dog crossing the empty square with purposeful, oblivious energy. What happens to Fenwick now? She asked. It stays under my protection. His voice was flat and certain, with considerably more attention than it received before. She believed him. The sun climbed. The village woke around them slowly, cautiously, like something testing whether the ground was safe to walk on again. A woman emerged from the nearest house with a child on her hip. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old, who looked at the 2 strangers on the wall with the wide, unafraid curiosity of someone too young to have learned that certain people were supposed to be intimidating. The boy pointed at Lucian's braids. Lucian looked at the boy. Something in his face shifted, the careful blankness dissolving into something much simpler and much older. He held still while the child stared, and then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth moved. The mother apologized and carried the boy back inside. Clara said nothing, but she had seen it. They rode back to the Ridgehold that afternoon, and somewhere on the long mountain road, with the pines moving on either side and the cold air carrying the first real promise of winter, Clara understood something she had been assembling piece by piece since the moment a wounded stranger had filled her doorframe and bled on her stone floor. He was not a simple man. He was not an easy man. He carried things that had made him hard in places, and he had built walls with a thoroughness and craftsmanship that suggested he had started young and never fully stopped. He ruled through authority, because authority was what the fractured, violent world he'd inherited had required of him. But underneath all of it, underneath the iron and the distance and the pale, still eyes that made soldiers straighten when they felt his gaze, there was someone who checked on sick men in the night and kept careful notes about water access in small villages, and had looked at a 4-year-old boy pointing at his braids and almost smiled. She didn't say any of this. Some things, she had learned, were better held quietly for a while. A month passed, then 2. The sick soldiers of the Eastern Quarter returned to full duty, and Dora, who had sat beside them through the worst nights, was quietly given a promotion in the kitchen hierarchy that everyone understood and no one formally acknowledged as connected. Brennan lost some of the tension around his eyes that Clara had noticed when she first arrived. The Ridgehold's small infirmary, which had previously been stocked with the functional minimum and little expertise, began to change. New jars appeared on the shelves. Certain records were started and kept with consistent care. A second healer was brought from the eastern settlements to assist during the winter months, a young man named Fen, who was competent and eager and grateful for guidance, and Clara gave it to him without reservation. She stayed, not because she was ordered to. The order, such as it had ever been, had dissolved somewhere between Fenwick and the mountain road home. She stayed because the work was real and needed, and because the ridge hold, which she had entered as a stranger summoned by a wounded king, had gradually and without ceremony become somewhere she recognized. Edna had told her once, in the particular way the old woman had of delivering important things as though they were obvious. Home isn't where you're from, it's where your work matters. Clara had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. On a morning in late autumn, the first hard frost of the season crystallizing on the courtyard stones and the pines standing white-edged against a pale sky, Clara was in the library returning a volume when she found Lucian already there. He was standing at the window with a cup of something warm, looking out at the frost-bright courtyard below. He heard her and turned. "The new supply of elderflower arrived this morning," he said, which was not what she had expected him to say. "Good." She slid the book into its place. "We'll need it before the winter's done." A pause. Outside, the courtyard was busy with the morning's work. The same rhythms she had learned over the past weeks, as familiar now as her own heartbeat. "You could go back," Lucian said. "To Ashvale. The road is still passable for another few weeks before the deep snow." Clara looked at him. He was looking out the window, not at her, and his voice was very careful in the way that people's voices are when they're saying something that costs them more than the words suggest. "I know," she said. "There's nothing holding you here." She crossed the room and stood beside the window. Below, Brennan was crossing the courtyard with two younger soldiers, saying something that made them both straighten imperceptibly. Dora appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, checked the sky for weather, and went back inside. "There's nothing holding me in Ashvale anymore either," Clara said. "Edna is gone. The village has a midwife who can handle most of what they need." She paused. "There are 12 people in Fenwick who are alive because I was in this territory when they needed help. There are 4 soldiers on the Eastern Patrol who recovered faster than they should have because someone knew what marsh lung looked like and how to treat it." She looked at him. "The work here is real." Lucian turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment, the same look he had given her in the very beginning, when she had walked into his study and started issuing instructions about illness containment. The look that was really a question, and that she was beginning to understand, he asked only when something had caught him genuinely off guard. "Then stay," he said. It was not a command. It was something much simpler and considerably harder to say. "I intend to," she said. Outside, the frost caught the light as the sun climbed above the tree line, and the ridge hold, dark stone and iron and old pine, filled briefly with something cold and clear and bright. The years that followed were not simple. Power is never simple, and the world the ridgehold sat within was not simple either. There were disputes and hard winters and seasons that tested the territory in ways that kept the map room lit long into the night. Dorian Ashcroft stood before the gathered pack council and faced judgment for Fenwick, and the 2 families who had lost people watched with dry, exhausted eyes as justice was rendered. Not satisfying, the way justice rarely is, but real. Lucian ruled. Clara healed. The infirmary grew into something the fortress had never had before. A true place of recovery, properly stocked and properly staffed, known eventually in villages across the northern corridor as the place where the sick were sent and came back from. Brennan, in his 50s, began teaching the younger soldiers with a patience that surprised everyone who had only known his scarred and formidable exterior, and didn't surprise Clara at all. Dora became, in time, the person who ran the kitchen with the same no-nonsense authority as Hesta before her, and she kept a jar of elderflower on her shelf always, because she had learned what it was for and never forgot. And Clara, who had come to the ridge hold with a satchel of medicines and no intention of staying, who had spent 3 years alone in a stone cottage, learning that grief could be survived, and work could be a kind of anchor. Clara found that the walls she had built around herself after that long-ago sickness had taken her family. The walls she had tended carefully and trusted completely had developed, without her noticing, significant gaps. She did not patch them. She let the cold air in. She let the firelight in. She let the particular kind of knowing that comes from watching someone through hard work and hard seasons and hard decisions and seeing what they are made of. She let that in too. On a winter evening, many months after the frost morning in the library, she and Lucian sat in the small room where they had first eaten together, and the fire burned, and outside the snow fell thick and silent against the dark pines, and they talked until the candles burned low, about the territory, about the people in it, about what Edna had told her once about home, about things that happened long ago that were not, as it turned out, entirely finished, and the ridgehold, which had been built to last and never to be loved, held all of it in its old stone walls without comment, which was, in the end, exactly what it had always been made for. The 6 soldiers of the Eastern Patrol grew old in the service they had chosen, and spoke sometimes of the winter the marsh lung came, and the healer arrived who did not flinch at anything. Dora's elderflower jar sat on its shelf through many winters and was never empty. Brennan, whose name had made men straighten for 30 years, sat in the courtyard in his final seasons and told the youngest soldiers things that surprised them. The village of Fenwick rebuilt its water channel with stone brought down from the upper ridge, funded quietly from the hold's treasury, and the fountain at its center ran clear through every season that followed. Clara's satchel hung on a hook beside the infirmary door, worn soft from years of use, still packed, still ready. The ridgehold stood on its cliff through storms and thaws and the long, slow turning of years, its fires visible on clear nights from the villages below. A fixed point in the darkness, a light that people in the valley learned, eventually, to find reassuring rather than forbidding. It had been built to endure. It did.